Welcome to the Start Here podcast for web development. I'm Keith Monahan.
And I'm Dane Miller.
And we're here to show you how to build a career in web dev. You can find us online at starthere.fm.
Hey Keith, how's it going?
Good. Things are good. How are you doing?
Doing pretty well. Had a pretty interesting week. How about yourself?
It was a good week for the most part. Yeah.
Was it more productive this time than weeks previous?
Yeah, partly. Definitely, I started a new project, and that was a lot of fun. There's one thing I've been struggling with is I've mentioned I work within WordPress.
Yeah.
And I'm using an event management plugin for this client website we're building, and it has been a hassle to wrangle into making it do what I want it to do. So that has been disappointing. I spent a little more time on that than I wanted to, and it's still not even fixed yet. So Monday morning, gotta dig in. But I guess the benefit is that I'm digging into WordPress, like the core functionality, I guess, and so I'm becoming more familiar with it, which is only going to help me do a better, more efficient job, more quick job, in the future.
Yeah, a lot of people feel like they would hate to dive that deep into WordPress, right? How do you feel about, you're mitigating that, it sounds like, with just, you seem to be enjoying it because you know it's going to benefit you later.
Mm-hmm. Well, I started learning web dev by going straight PHP, and then I started learning to build with a PHP framework called Code Igniter, and I resisted WordPress because I wanted to build it all myself, which is a lot of fun, but it takes so much time. And so building on WordPress, it's a platform that already exists. It has the whole back-end admin section already built out and designed, and so you don't have to go and build that every time you start a project.
Yep.
So, and there's a huge community of developers who build widgets and plugins and all these other things and themes. You can totally change the design of your site. So I resisted it at first. Actually, for about a year, I resisted it, and then I started diving in because that is kind of the industry standard for your typical small business website, which is what we do a lot of.
Right. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. So it's been good to dive in and get to know it better. Well, it gives me more flexibility in knowing what I can do for our clients and their websites,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've struggled with this too. It's this whole concept of the advanced beginner. So the concept being that if you don't dive in deep on certain topics or focus solely on a certain topic and dive in deep, and instead if you go general on a bunch of things, you'll often get caught in this trap of the advanced beginner, where you know a little bit about everything, but you don't know a lot about anything. And I've definitely found that that's a huge problem for web developers because there's so many tools and so many frameworks and new resources coming out. And even small things, like there's so many IDEs, there's so many text editors, that everybody is an advanced beginner on pretty much everything. And that's great because you're a generalist, but it definitely isn't that great also in the same token because you aren't able to specialize as deeply as perhaps your job might require.
Yeah, you can't be as efficient as you might be if you were just dedicated to that one thing.
Yeah, for sure.
I struggle with that in the beginning as well, just jumping from framework to framework, or in the beginning I tried out a few different text editors, and until I found one, it was hard because it's a little bit different. There's a learning curve, and you don't want to get stuck continually on a learning curve. You have to specialize.
Yeah. I also battle that, and the way that I mitigate it is to focus. So I'll tell myself, there's all these things that I want to do, and there's all these things I want to look at, which is the same for all of us. We all want to do that. But I'll tell myself I will spend 1 month on this one thing, and I will learn it to its completion, or at least to a sufficient level of knowledge before I move on to something else. So if it's a text editor, then I will spend a month with it, or I'll spend at least 3 weeks with it. And I will go in deep. I'll understand the settings, all the configs, all the options and packages that come along with it. Again, just so that I can make sure that I understand the choice before jumping on to something else. It's the same when people try WordPress and then they might try something else. And they're just kind of jumbling all these different choices and they don't go in deep for a month. I mean, people often feel like they don't have the time, but really, if you think about it this way, if you think about it in the sense that if you spend a month juggling a bunch of different choices and not knowing much about any of them, then you're literally wasting time.
Right.
So that's a waste of time. What you could do is you could spend 1 month learning something deeply and then switch to something else and learn that deeply. And then you have 2 months of completely positive time. So I like to look at it that.
Yeah. And because you're actually, during that time, you're actually able to produce something.
Yeah.
You can build something.
Right. Also, I mean, maybe let's say you don't even produce anything. At least you've gained an in-depth, deep knowledge of something, in which case you are already ahead of, I believe, 90% of people, right, in that area. Because a lot of people do get stuck in this advanced beginner trap. So I think just diving in, you're doing much better than a lot of people. So I try to support people when they want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes back to that idea that you just have to start. You have to start coding right now. Just go do it.
Yeah.
Don't procrastinate anymore, right? But hey, how was your week?
My week was pretty good. Have been doing a lot of documentation, so have been doing a lot less coding. I don't think I coded once this week, which was totally, I know, really strange. But I've been living in Google Docs, developing all these different proposals and all these different sort of specifications. We're doing a lot of different projects at work, and a lot of them are in the phase of they are all about to start at once. So somebody's got to sort of sit down for a good amount of time and say, this is a specification for each of these. We're transferring a bunch of sites over to WordPress. We're doing some marketing stuff and some other stuff. So I've just been mainly writing, which is, I find that to be fun too, because, thinking about the future and sort of positioning yourself strategically in a way that you're going to benefit most in the future, I find that to be a lot of fun.
That is really interesting. And so that's not really web development, right? Like what?
No.
But that's part of your job duties at this company.
It is. Well, it is web development in a sense, because as a web developer, you probably should know how to write a specification document. So you should be able to say, the website that I'm building, like let's say that your goal as a web developer is to be a freelancer. You should be able to communicate with that client that you have as a freelancer and define specifications with him, and then create a document yourself that contains those specifications. Like the website should be able to do this, so on and so forth. And so I think it is sort of a general web developist knowledge that you should have. But yeah, it's not typically something that a web developer would do.
No, but that brings up a good point, because even if you're designing on the front end or not exactly working for the client directly, understanding how to work off of a spec is kind of hand in hand with being able to write one.
Yeah, for certain. And it is challenging. It's different. It's definitely a different type of mind state, especially given the fact that this specification is going to be usually for some other person that's not a developer. So you're writing it for a client, or you're writing it for a product manager or somebody else, like maybe even the CEO if it's a really small company, and you have to write it in a really human readable way. You can't, write as a developer, sort of like the developer language. You kind of have to put on your user friendly face and write that way, which that can be fun too. It's a great skill to have.
Yeah, it is a different skill. That's good. Cool. That's fun. I like creating those kinds of documents as well, but I think that's just the geek in me. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. Same here.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about the web developer's tool belt. So we're going to get into the different tools that we use and frameworks and languages and all of that good stuff. Basically everything that we touch kind of on a day-to-day basis for production.
Exactly. Yeah, so we're going to go over text editors, we're going to go over IDEs, browsers, front-end frameworks, back-end frameworks, local host setups, our favorite of all of the above, some favorite web hosts, stuff like that. So everything that you will need as a web developer in your tool belt, everything that you'll need as a resource, we hope to touch that a little bit today.
Yep, you can find this show online at starthere.fm/webdev/4.
In this episode, we'll actually have a really thorough show notes, obviously, to link out to all these things. So feel free, don't need to take notes. Just head on over there to that link that Keith just provided, and you'll see all the notes on everything we talked about.
Yeah, any product we mentioned, we will link to as well, so you can go find out more about it. Let's get into text editors, Dane. So there are a lot of text editors. There's different types of text editors. Something as simple as TextEdit on a Mac or Notepad on Windows, which are your very most basic text editors, and you can develop in those. But then we can get very more complicated as far as text editors go. What are some of the text editors that you've used, Dane?
Yeah, so I'm just going to give an outline of various text editors on Windows and on Mac, and then we're going to go into IDEs and just give you a brief outline of IDEs on Windows and IDEs on Mac. So again, these are all going to be in the show notes, and we recommend exploring to find your favorites. Obviously, you're going to be living in these every day as a developer. So again, it's the same thing. It's very important. The chair that you sit on, the computer that you're looking at, the text editor you're using, all of these are really important because you're going to spend 8 to 10 hours a day, perhaps more, in these tools. So some of the text editors that I like.
And actually, before we dive too far, what is kind of the realm for the text editor? In the big picture, that's where we're writing our HTML, CSS, and server.
Yeah, so that's where we're writing the HTML, CSS, whatever backend language. That's where we're writing that as well, usually. If it's an IDE, perhaps that's where we're running our servers. So an IDE is an integrated development environment. It might have buttons that say run server. So it makes it really easy for you to run those servers, to do things like that. An IDE might have testing, so it's going to be a place where you go to write your code every day. So that's the main big picture. First, though, we're going to dive into text editors. So we're going to touch on Windows. Windows is the thing that I have the least bit of experience with, because when I started my programming career, I actually switched to a Mac because Macs are based on a Unix shell environment. So a lot of development environments really benefit from being on a Mac, but I used Windows for my entire life before that, so I have some experience. So on Windows, I've used Notepad and Notepad++. So Notepad is just the basic text editor that actually comes with every Windows computer, and it's totally capable of programming your code in. So writing code, you can do all of that. Yeah. Notepad++ is a simple extension off of that allows you, it's another program, but it's based on Notepad, and it simply has syntax highlighting. So basically what syntax highlighting is as you write your code, your HTML, your CSS, your JavaScript, your PHP, whatever, it will highlight different parts of the code so that it's easier for you to read, and it's just more pleasing to the eye. And it's something that developers usually can't live without, so it's very difficult for a developer to use a program that doesn't have syntax highlighting. It can just be very challenging because you get used to it, and it is very helpful, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And then moving on to the Mac environment, we have various tools, text editors for Mac. So to start off with, one of the oldest are VI and Emacs. So these are terminal-based text editors that you actually run inside your terminal. And they've been around since probably before the 80s, but at least the 80s. So these are very, very old editors that have been modified and played around with for a long, long time. A lot of people, these editors specifically have a emphasis on using the keyboard to navigate your code as opposed to the mouse. So normally in most text editors, you'll scroll up and down with your mouse and you'll click around with your mouse. But in these editors, Vim and Emacs, they have an emphasis on being able to do all that on the keyboard so that your hands never actually have to leave the keyboard. So if there's a type of preference that you might have, or if you play around with it and you realize you actually like that, then that might be the text editor for you. And then there's Textmate. Textmate is a great text editor on Mac, and it used to be really popular. It actually recently went open source, so you can get it for free. They do still have a paid option as well, but you can get it for free. It is a great little text editor. It is not something that I use anymore. Everybody that used to use Textmate that I know of on a Mac has switched over to Sublime. So then you have the category of text editors that are ultra customizable. So there's a couple text editors for Mac that are ultra customizable. So Sublime and Atom, Atom. So these are two that I would consider to be the most customizable and the most popular on the Mac currently.
And we should mention both of those are for Windows as well.
They are for Windows as well, and they're both free up until a certain point. And then, I mean, well, technically they're both free forever, but you can pay for Sublime if you choose, sort of like as a donation, I guess. But they are both very customizable in the sense that the preferences are, it's just basically a file. So like the preferences for Sublime and Atom, it's just a big file. So it's literally text-based preferences, because these are text editors that are kind of made for hackers. So they're made to be extended and they're made to be extensible. So these are very, very robust text editors, and Sublime actually has a package management community. So you can install via the Sublime console a snippet, and it will install a package manager. And then there's all these people that have built plugins and packages for Sublime to do different things, and it's really, really helpful.
You know, I've read about that, and I've seen some kind of examples. But what's a common use case for that? Like, what kind of a package would you install?
Yeah, so some of the packages that I have are, so when you first download Sublime and you open the file tree on the left and you try to right click a file, there's like 2 or 3 options. There's really not much going on there. There's like a diff, there's very few options, but you can actually install a package called Sidebar Enhancement, and it will give you all the options that you normally would have when you right click a file. So you can copy it, move it, download, change it, rename it. It has all the normal options, which is kind of strange that Sublime doesn't, but this is the whole point of the package community, right? Is they notice a deficiency in the program, so they create a package to obviously fill that deficiency. A couple others that I have are some documentation helpers, so some things that help me document code easier. Some less and SAS, which is CSS precompilers. You can actually integrate those right in. They have some FTP packages, so you can combine this to make it really just like an IDE, and you can connect to a server and download the files remotely. That's
pretty
other
cool.
Yeah, and there's a lot of GitHub sort of integration, so I have some packages that will show me in line what lines have been removed and added in the file, which is really nice. So it's just stuff like that.
Okay, that's pretty fun. Maybe we can link to some of those in the show notes.
Yeah.
What would you say your favorite package is, or maybe the package that you find increases your productivity the most?
Anytime I get a new Mac or a new Sublime setup, I always install the Sidebar Enhancements, because that's really useful. And then I always install Git Gutter, which will just show me in the gutter what lines of a file have been added and removed as I'm typing, so that like when I'm looking at it, I can note really quickly. But honestly, not really so much. Like I like to stay pretty simple, so this is why I'm not like a big IDE kind of guy, because I like to stay pretty simple and pretty minimal. I don't really download many packages. I do also use Emmet, which is like which is the Zen coding extension, so that you can do HTML really quickly. But that's that's definitely a topic for another show, and our advanced HTML show will cover that. But yeah, I mean, I like to keep it pretty simple.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I obviously I like to keep it simple. I haven't ever installed packages, but that Sidebar Enhancer sounds interesting, so
yeah,
take a look.
Definitely very useful. There's definitely some packages. If you just Google the top 10 packages for Sublime Text, you'll find a lot of blog posts that talk about this, and again, there's some that are mission critical for sure. So alongside those IDEs, we have alongside those text editors, we have something called IDEs, which are, as we said, integrated development environments. They are usually a text editor with a bunch of functionality that is around it. So it's a program that has a text editor. It has some language-specific functions. So for Rails, it might have running the server, installing bundles or gems. For PHP, it might have something that does a MAMP setup for you, configures MAMP or runs the PHP environment in some way. For JavaScript, if you have a JavaScript IDE, it might help you write JavaScript unit tests. So it is usually an IDE that is very specific, but has a lot of functionality. So you have a bunch of different types of IDEs, and that's what we're going to go into next. So you have language-specific IDEs, like I just discussed. Then you have IDEs that work on every language. So an example of an IDE that runs on Windows and works with every language that I know of is Visual Studio. So Visual Studio is a very, very robust Microsoft-based IDE. It'll allow you to do C# code, JavaScript code, Python, Ruby, pretty much anything. And there's a lot of like packages for Visual Studio that allow you to do those types of coding languages easier. So it has a JavaScript unit testing package and stuff like that. So it is very robust. It is definitely the biggest IDE in the world, definitely the most popular.
And the idea with the IDE is that, they're integrated with tools that help you perform more quickly, right? And maybe more efficiently. And so as you spend more time with an IDE, I think it's something that there's a learning curve to it to figure out those shortcuts and, how best to write in that environment. But eventually you can experience some pretty good productivity enhancements as you figure it out and learn it.
Yeah, it's definitely geared towards making your life easier. So that's the whole point of an IDE, is it's to make your life easier as a developer. And I know a lot of people that use IDEs that can't live without them. So that should be something that's said. Like, a lot of people love them and they can't code without them. So that's definitely important. So we have also language-specific IDEs. So JetBrains is a company that makes IDEs for specific languages. So for instance, if you're writing Ruby, they have RubyMine. If you're writing Python, they have PyCharm. If you're writing JavaScript or HTML and CSS, they have WebStorm. If you're writing PHP, they have PHPStorm. So these are very, very specialized IDEs. Again, they might have specific functions for those languages, and it's to make your life easier when you're writing in those languages, which is very cool. And then you have front-end IDEs that are specialized for front-end, like WebStorm, like I already mentioned. But there's also Coda. So Coda is made by Panic Software. And Coda is like a front-end text editor / IDE. I consider it kind of an integrated development environment because it does have a lot of front-end functionality, connects to an FTP server by default and stuff like that. So a really great environment. And then the last one we'll mention is Dreamweaver, which is obviously an Adobe product. It's gotten a bit of flack over the years for various reasons, but a lot of people do use it to code. It is a WYSIWYG development environment, so as you code, you can actually see the output of your code. I don't believe it connects to any backend frameworks. It's mainly for static HTML and CSS and JavaScript, but it is something that some people do like to use.
Yeah, and then there's a couple browser-based environments. So your text editors and IDEs, you install those to your computer, but there are actually a couple services that you can access through the browser to, you have your environment online, which is cool if you tend to switch computers a lot.
Yeah, or like, let's say you're going to school and you bought a Google Chromebook. So like you bought maybe a $299 little cheap Google Chromebook and you want to program on it. So you can do that. I have a friend that does that actually. And they develop really cool Ruby on Rails applications all from their Google Chromebook. And as you know, the Chromebook actually can't install applications. It is all browser. Everything is done in the browser, so you can use these browser-based coding environments. One of them is called Coding, so that's KODING.com, and that is basically a really interesting coding environment online. And then another one is Cloud9, so you can access that by going to c9.io. And both of those are very fascinating and very different. So I would just explore those a little bit.
How should people think about choosing, one of these options, right? I mean, should somebody choose a text editor? Should they go with an IDE, or maybe choose one of the online like browser-based services? Like, why would they choose one or the other? Do you have some ideas there?
Yeah, I think it comes down to personal preference a lot of the times. If you're really a simplistic type of person, if you really like something that is streamlined and super, super simple, and when you're coding, maybe all you want to see is the code and that's it and nothing else, then you're going to want to go with a text editor. So very minimal, very simple. Again, you're going to have to run the server in the terminal. But that's actually very common, right? And
that depends on which server-side language you're using.
Yeah, it does. It depends on which server-side. And if you're one of the types of people that really likes to have all the tools and widgets and all the little like buttons and everything around you so that your life is a little bit easier, then I would go with an IDE. Again, it's a lot more configuration. There's a lot more on the screen at any given time.
Probably a bigger learning curve.
There's a bigger learning curve, but a lot of advanced programmers do love IDEs. I mean, again, here's a use case. You're coding one day, you notice that you need to go back and look at the history of a file. So how do you do that? Do you go on GitHub? Well, with an IDE, you can right click on the file and click view history. And if it's connected to GitHub, then it will literally show you a history of that file throughout its lifespan. And you can just click on the file back in time and look at another teammate who maybe edited this file and see what they did. So, I mean, it's stuff like that really you can't do in any other way. I actually have almost all of these IDEs on my computer, along with almost all of these text editors. So the reason that I do that is because I like to experiment with different things, but also because I use them when I need them. Right. So at my day job, we use Python, and I will open PyCharm when I need to do exactly what I just described, when I need to view the history of a file. I'll also use it when I want the Python syntax highlighting and syntax editing. It'll actually tell me that I have a syntax error also.
Nice.
And, Ruby, sometimes I'll open the Ruby one if I need to do something really crazily complicated. Similarly for Coda. So if I'm doing something with CSS and I need a Sass compiler or some kind of crazy front end thing, maybe I'll open Coda because it's really nice for that. But usually I'll be using my text editors. But again, I'll just use everything as is needed.
Right.
Yep.
So what's your favorite text editor then? What's your go-to?
Definitely has been Sublime for years and years. I'll use Textmate often. I have Sublime, Textmate, and Atom in my dock, and I'm experimenting with Atom because I really like it, but I just started experimenting with that this past week. But Sublime is my go-to for coding, and Textmate I'll use for writing notes. So like I'll usually have a text editor open for notes because as a programmer you have a lot of like notes that you have to take about like what you're writing, maybe just like the feature or even code related stuff. So I like to keep that out of the current text editor that I'm actually using for coding. That's just a personal preference because I don't like to mix it's like separation of concerns kind of thing. Yeah. So I'll usually have all those running.
That's a good idea. That's interesting. Yeah, Sublime is my personal favorite as well. In fact, I think it's the only one I've used since I started programming, and
it's a good choice.
I mean, it speaks, to how good of a program Sublime is. I haven't needed to use a different text editor.
Yeah, and it's definitely the largest community as well. So.
Yeah, so that's a good one. So if you're unsure, you can go and you can take a look at a bunch of these. We'll link to them in the show notes, and don't get too bogged down with this. If you just want to get going, maybe try Sublime or Atom. Those are fantastic. You won't be sorry to have learned those. So as you're starting web development, there's the tools. You're figuring out how to do the whole workflow between the text editor and your browser, and maybe you've installed a server on your local environment. And in general, for your computer, you don't need anything fancy, really. There are some people that maybe want to go and buy new flashy computers and devices because they think they need that, but almost any computer can be developed with.
Mm-hmm.
The text editors, their system requirements are minimal, really minimal, and probably I would assume many of the IDEs as well. With the computer, with whatever computer you choose, you can choose Mac or Windows, and I would say, choose something you're comfortable with, because it'll just be more efficient for you to work in that environment. Of course, Dane, you switched platforms right when you started coding. I guess
but either one is perfectly fine.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, I develop in Windows, and I really like that environment. So the choice is yours. Yeah, don't get too caught up in the flame wars for the different platforms there.
Yeah.
I think in previous episodes we talked about our favorite browser to use.
Yep.
And I would encourage everyone to avoid using Internet Explorer for developing. There are better browsers that are more on the forefront of the technologies, and I think Chrome and Firefox are the two that are probably at the forefront there.
Definitely, yeah. You always want to find one that has the easiest to use development environment, so that the debugging tools are all very important. Mm-hmm. Again, I think we both agree Chrome is the one to go there.
Mm-hmm. So as far as other things in your web development toolkit, you'll work with the text editor and your computer and the browser and all that good stuff, and then you'll pretty quickly learn that you need to be able to do more than just write, straight HTML, CSS, and then like PHP or Ruby or Python or whatever your other chosen language is. Mm-hmm. And what I'm getting at is that there are libraries and packages and frameworks that are pre-built that do a lot of functionality, a lot of the basic functionality for you. Mm-hmm. And there's a few different types of frameworks.
So with frameworks, you have usually back-end frameworks and server-side frameworks and front-end frameworks. So when I say back-end, I mean server-side. So for front-end frameworks, you have two categories. You have usually JavaScript frameworks and HTML and CSS frameworks. So the difference is JavaScript frameworks will allow you to build an application in a new way, so a reinvent the wheel type of way. And HTML and CSS frameworks might have a JavaScript component, but it's simply a library. So it's a HTML and CSS reinvention of how to do that, but the JavaScript component will simply be a library. So the difference here would be things like, here's how I would sort of silo those. Bootstrap, Foundation, and UIKit are examples of HTML and CSS frameworks that might have a JavaScript component, but JavaScript frameworks are going to be things like Angular JS, Bootstrap JS, Ember JS, et cetera, et cetera. So those are frameworks that, again, reinvent the wheel for how to develop applications on the client side using JavaScript. And we will have a very detailed episode about JavaScript frameworks very far down the line when we get into JavaScript more deeply. So that's something you don't really need to think about right now. But with HTML and CSS frameworks, we did actually mention this in a previous episode, but some ones that we like are Bootstrap, Foundation, and UIKit. They allow you to develop applications very quickly. They look very nice, so the design element is very nice. And the grid systems are very powerful.
Yeah, and so the HTML and CSS frameworks are skeletons that you install them, and then you build your website using those elements from the different framework, from the framework. And that, just like the IDE, it can kind of help you get to something more quickly. You can build a full, admin panel for the back end of a website, if you're not using WordPress, more quickly, which can be helpful if it doesn't need to be super customized.
Yeah, exactly. So Keith, why don't you tell us about some server-side frameworks that complement those front-end frameworks that we just discussed?
Right. So with the frameworks, so you've got your chosen programming language that you might use if you're working on the, in the back end on the server side. And so you could be using, PHP, Python, or Ruby, and that's the core language. And then you can have a framework, and just like the front-end framework, the server-side framework, it will extend the language. So for PHP, you've got frameworks like, there's a bunch of them, but the one I've used was Code Igniter, and I think that one's kind of dying, if it's not dead. The newest one is Laravel. And they do a lot of stuff that you pretty much always need to do when you're building an app. And that's kind of baked into the framework. That's cool. And then, of course, Ruby has Ruby on Rails, which I don't really have much of any experience with, but it's the same concept. Mm-hmm. It allows you to extend the language, and it has a lot of, in some cases, more than other PHP frameworks. It's a little opinionated, but it allows you to create something very quickly.
And one thing we should mention with these frameworks is you might be asking why have this framework at all. So a lot of the times these frameworks will be created because they are a way to interface between the database and the UI application logic. Or maybe not the UI logic, but the business logic. So if you have some business logic on your application and that business logic needs to query the database, they want to provide a way for you to not have to write raw SQL to do that query. Because obviously, SQL, it's just something that a lot of people don't know. So if they can abstract that, and perhaps you can learn Rails, and you can learn Rails' ORM layer, which is object relational mapping, then you can query the database and never write a line of SQL in your entire life. Of course, you can write SQL in all of these frameworks. You can do it in Django, you can do it in Rails, but again, they try to abstract it such that you don't have to. In most scenarios.
Right. And the other benefit is that there is just a ton of stuff to think about when you're writing a program. Mm-hmm. And more than just writing the SQL, you have to worry about security and accessibility and all these other things. And those can be very complicated. Mm-hmm. But with a framework, they're done for you. And so as long as you're following the documentation for the framework and you're using it correctly, then you have a certain amount of comfort knowing that some of those things are taken care of for you.
Exactly.
So how do we get those on our computer when we're working, right? So we can't just run PHP from a text editor, right? Or Ruby on Rails. Those have to be run on a server.
Yeah. So when you're developing an application locally, you want to install something that's called a localhost environment for that programming language. So every programming language will have one, and every programming language framework will usually have one as well. So for PHP, so basically the big picture is you want a way to run a PHP website, or you want a way to run a Ruby on Rails website or a Python website, right? So and by Python and Ruby, I obviously mean Rails and Django, or for Rails, Sinatra as well. So because these languages are very much not compiled, you need a way to do that, and that is a localhost environment. So you can, for PHP, an example is MAMP, which is a way to set up a PHP environment and point it at your PHP files, so that anytime you go to a localhost web address, it will point, that web address will access your computer, and the computer will say, okay, well, I actually have a PHP application that web address is pointed to, and then that will point to your files. So as you make changes in those files, it'll be reflected in the website. And for Ruby on Rails, you have things like Rails, which when you install Rails, it gives you some servers called WebBrick for one, and you can install others like Thin, etc., Unicorn, and you can run those from the terminal. So with Rails, you do Rails server. You call that from the terminal after you install your Rails app. For Python, it's fairly similar. You set up Django, and Django will help you set up a development environment and a localhost environment as well. So all of the frameworks will usually give you a step-by-step walkthrough of how to do that, which is which is really nice.
Yeah, definitely. And so the whole idea is that when you're programming, you're writing logic that needs to be processed, a lot of if-then statements, and so it's not just simple HTML and CSS, which is static, right? The HTML and the CSS, they don't really do anything as far as logic goes, and so that's where your server comes in. Your server has to be able to process that programming logic. So that's what you will need on your computer, and there's a few different server environments that you can install. So some other things that you'll need to think about, and so the localhost, the server on your computer, you'll need that for development. But then as you move on and maybe you want to actually put your first website on the internet, you will need a web host to do that. You'll need to be able to, put your files out there on the internet. There are any number of different web host companies that host your files, and then, you'll be able to buy a domain and point your domain to the files and be able to access it there. Different web hosts tend to focus on languages and frameworks, and so some hosts are better for Rails than PHP, and vice versa. I think the one web host that we both have a little experience with is Bluehost.
Yep.
And that works well. I've used that for PHP applications. Have you used it for anything else besides PHP?
I've used it for WordPress, which is PHP only.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, and so that works really well. And then what do you use for Rails?
So for Rails, I recommend Heroku. Heroku is free, and it really is easy to integrate with Rails. You can simply create a new Heroku by installing the Heroku tool belt to your terminal, and then calling Heroku create, and then git push Heroku master, and you will have a website on Heroku. So it's pretty simple.
Wow, it's free.
Yeah, it's free. So it's free for the first dyno. You can think of a dyno like a server. It's not exactly that, but it is similar to that. So for the first dyno, it's free. If you want to increase dynos, it costs money. If you want to set up a production database, it costs money. But the basic PostgreSQL database, along with one dyno, is free, and that will achieve the results of about 4,000 to 5,000 users per month, I think, would be fine on one dyno. So you should be good to go if you ever need a Rails app.
And have you ever used that free version for a website in production or an application in production?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yep. Okay, cool. So it definitely would work. Hey, that's a pretty good benefit for learning Rails.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have multiple clients that are using it in production right now.
Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. Well, so right now I use a different host. I use a company called A Small Orange, and it's pretty much the same thing as Bluehost. It's standard set of tools and languages that they support. Let's see here. Right now, it's like $10 a month to get an account set up. It's a shared hosting account, so I can put my files on there, and essentially the resources are shared with other accounts, other websites. And that's good because it is pretty inexpensive. But if you get put on a server, at the company that's bogged down, then your website can run pretty slow. And we see this a lot at GoDaddy. And so we don't recommend hosting your website at GoDaddy. And I think I don't know for sure, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but it seems like they overload their servers with too many accounts. And in general, their websites tend to run slower, especially if you're on a WordPress site that tends to run a lot of database queries. It can be very slow on GoDaddy.
Yeah, so we avoid GoDaddy for that and for a few other reasons, moral issues and ethical issues. But we recommend Bluehost, HostGator, Heroku, Phone, AppFog, EngineYard, pretty much anything but GoDaddy.
Yeah, and you were saying that HostGator had some pretty good kind of introduction pricing for really small stuff.
I have a number of blogs that actually run on HostGator, and they all are running for $1 a month.
Man, that's pretty good.
Yeah, they have an option for $1 a month. I think it might be a promotion, but the other option is $3 a month. So either way, that's pretty cheap.
Yeah, that's definitely cheap. Cool. Okay, so those are some options for getting your website up and going on the internet. Oh, we didn't talk about registrars, about buying a domain.
Yep.
Right? So the two different things you need to consider when you're wanting to put a website on the web is you'll have to have your files hosted somewhere. That's the web host we just talked about. And you'll need a domain name that points to those files.
Yep.
So it's the www.starthere.fm is our domain name, and those point to our host. And a lot of web hosting companies you can also purchase your domains through, but you don't have to. You can purchase your domain anywhere and just point it to your hosting files. And there's any number of registrars for purchasing domains, just like with web hosts. And some are better than others. Let's see here. I use namecheap.com. That seems to work pretty well for me. Do you have a preferred registrar?
Yeah, I use Hover for everything that
Okay.
I do when I register a domain. Hover is really good, really minimal. You register a domain. It's pretty much it. I mean, it's super simple, really cool, great customer support, excellent company. Can't recommend it high enough. And then I've also used Gandhi, which is a registrar that will allow you to register very obscure TLDs. So if you want very strange TLDs, like for instance, the Italian TLD.ly, or not, that's Libya. There's some TLDs that are more difficult to get, and you can only get them at specific registrars, and usually Gandhi will have those. If not, then you have to go to very specific registrars to get them in the country of origin for the TLD. So, yeah, that's something to keep in mind as well.
That is really interesting. I will check out that resource. I've often tried to find ways to purchase some of those more obscure TLDs, the top level domains. I know there are some tools online that can help you kind of come up with available domain names, and that's kind of like a domain name search. I mean, most places where you go, any place you go to buy a domain will have a search feature, and it'll tell you whether the one you want is available. I'm thinking of a particular tool I use. It's called Domainer, and that's DOMAI.NR, and that's kind of fun because you can type in your preferred domain and it'll tell you if it's available in a number of different TLDs, but then offer some suggestions as well that might be of interest to you. So that's kind of fun. I typically go there to brainstorm usually.
Oh, that's very cool. Very cool.
So we've kind of covered the big picture for web development tools, and we hope you enjoy it. We hope that you find the tool that works best for you, but we don't want you to overthink it too much. Okay? You can always learn something new and move on to something different, but don't jump ship too often. Like Dane was saying, spend a good chunk of time with a tool before you just give it up, because it takes time to figure these out and to realize those efficiencies. And so definitely don't get bogged down with, the fun, flashy, newest text editor that comes on the market or something like that. Find one, stick with it, and produce.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would recommend, again, just focus on experimenting for a month. If you really want to change text editors, do it, but try it for a month. And again, with all these different resources, pretty much anything that we named that we can put our name behind. So if you're trying to debate between Bluehost or HostGator for your WordPress site, it really doesn't matter. Just pick one, whatever one you can afford, maybe what's cheapest, go with that. Again, I mean, we've spent a lot of time doing this many, many years, and these are the resources that we like. So if you use it, you'll pretty much be happy.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for listening. We appreciate it. Come back next time. We're going to go into more about server-side languages and frameworks. Again, you can find us online at starthere.fm/webdev/4. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.